Hello folks, welcome back. Today I want to talk about getting started collecting pocket watches. I think this is a great time to get started collecting pocket watches because prices are very reasonable. The antiques market was kind of overheated 15 or 20 years ago, but since then prices have come way down and it's possible to own something really great for not a lot of money. As we get deeper into the options that you may have to start exploring, I do want to talk about a couple things about collecting in general. One of those is the difference between collecting or accumulating. Collecting means you have something specific that you're after. Accumulating means you just buy things. Now, that may sound kind of negative, and that's not my intention to make fun of people that accumulate, because I think everybody does that to some degree, especially when they're getting started. But it's a great idea to take some time to figure out what do you actually want to end up with, and to the degree that you can, use discipline to buy things that fit your ultimate plan rather than just accumulating whatever is available. There are a few different reasons that you may want to collect. One of those is the hope of making a profit. As I mentioned, prices are very reasonable now, much more so than in the decades past. And if you buy something great, you may indeed make a profit over time, as I believe value will increase eventually. Another reason you may be interested in collecting is because of the historical significance of some of the watches that you may run across. There may be a great story attached to it that gives you joy to think about having a piece in that history. And the third reason is just because watches are cool. You may have a mechanical interest in it. You may have just a love for the beauty of somebody's handiwork. And I think all of those are great. One of the things that you may want to consider is whether you want to be very selective, where you have a few more expensive pieces, or if you want to have a greater quantity of pieces that are maybe a little lower in value. Both of those, again, are totally fine. So what's out there? Watches fall into three primary categories: early watches, later American watches, and later European watches. Early watches like this one have a verge fusee escapement. This is a watch that dates from about 1760. It's got a cool pear case. There's the outer part of the case. And then the inner watch, we have a complete case itself where you wind it at the back. You would set the time at the front. Right there you can see where you put your key on to set the time. And here is our movement. You can see this is decorated, hand carved, and the fusee is over here. This is kind of a tapered grooved pulley. We'll talk about that in more detail in another video. And then here is part of the verge escapement mechanism. This watch, again, about 1760. This watch is a little newer. This is about 1820. This is another verge fusee watch in another pear case. It's a little bit more refined design. Similar idea, we wind in the back, we set on the hands, and on this one we can see there is our fusee mechanism. You can see the chain over here on the left. We have our pulley, tapered pulley, and then we have our escapement on that side. Moving a little bit later is this guy. This is another verge fusee. This is an English watch. I think this is a particularly pretty watch. It's got this nice carved two-tone case. We can see this one has a dust cover on it. And we can release this little catch, pull that off, and then again we have our movement. This guy says, "London chronometer maker to the Admiralty." There it is. This one is a little bit less figural than the others, but it's still the same idea. We've got our fusee mechanism, and you can see the sterling silver marks in this watch. What's great about these early watches is they're surprisingly affordable. These watches are just a couple $100s a piece, and I think they're beautiful and really cool and absolutely worth having in your collection somewhere. So now we move into later watches, and here we have a distinction between American watches and European watches. The American watchmaking industry got into swing in about the 1850s, and one of the differences in American watchmaking compared to European watchmaking was the adoption of mass production and figuring out how to make parts at a high enough precision so that they would be interchangeable from one watch to another. Watches generally started out being a larger key wind. I have an example right here. This is an American watch in Illinois. And this guy, we wind in the back and we set on the front again. This is a full plate watch with what's called gilt. That's this gold color. And there's a lot of these, and again, these are not particularly valuable. And so you can pick up an early American key wind watch for just a couple $100. This one is an 18 size watch, and this one happens to also be silver. As technology moved on, the major change that was made was moving to keyless works. Here's an example of a keyless works watch where you wind at the crown, and this is a lever set. This is a railroad watch, Illinois Bun Special. And we can set our watch with this lever at about the 2 position. Railroad watches are a topic unto themselves. I've already done a video on what kind of the history of the railroad watch is, and there's a lot more to that. Different brands, different rule sets as time went on. But they're very fun, and railroad watches tend to be a little bit more expensive than some of the other kinds, for better and worse. So we have the early watches, which are large. Generally, as time moves on, watches get smaller and more refined. We have our key wind watch, then we move into the keyless works. And the next phase would be 16 size watches. These watches are a little bit smaller. Interestingly, though, a 16 size watch and an 18 size watch, they're proportionally quite a bit different, and it's a little hard to show in my hand, but you can see the 18 size watch is much thicker. But 18 and 16 refer to the width of the movement, not the overall size of the watch. So a 16 size watch has almost the same movement size as an 18 size watch, but because watchmaking improved, the actual volume of the watch is quite a bit different. So this is another railroad watch. This one happens to have an up-down wind indicator. So right now the watch is wound down. And as I wind it up, you can see that hand at the top moving toward up. And this tells you how long it's been since you've last wound your watch. A very handy feature. Unfortunately, these can go for a little bit of money. On the European side, here we have sort of the equivalent of an 18 size watch. And we can see this is a fairly nice figural case. Again, this is a silver watch. We got a nice medallion on the back, Medal of Honor, 23 rubies, chronometer on it. But take a look at the inside of this guy. I've not counted the jewels to see if this actually does have 23 of them in it, and it does in some of these intermediate bridges here. But does that strike you as being particularly beautiful, or that somebody spent a lot of extra time making this watch when you compare that to either the key wind watch of perhaps the same era that has a nice gilt full plate movement, or you have the railroad watches of not too much later in time. Get my bezel on all the way on this. Where we have this nice figural pattern, engine turning, 2 tones. There's all kinds of variations on this. And so which would you rather have in your pocket? Would you rather have an American watch, or would you rather have a European watch? So today, Swiss watches are all the rage, and that's wonderful. There's nothing at all wrong with that. I have a number of Swiss watches myself, but that's a relatively new thing, that the Swiss were actually ahead of the Americans, and that didn't happen until perhaps the 1960s. Before that, the American watchmaking industry was, generally speaking, ahead. One of the things that the Europeans did, though, was they were more adventurous, and they tried a variety of things. Railroad watches are wonderful. This is a railroad watch. This is another railroad watch. But they all kind of look the same. And that actually was sort of the point. They wanted to be standardized. These are both easy to read Arabic dials. They've got 5-minute markers in red. They've got similar style of hands. They're both 16 size watches. There's a million of these, and there's nothing at all wrong with them, but that's kind of what they all look like. What's fun is if you're willing to experiment a little bit, you can get some really interesting things in the Swiss world. This is a giant purple guy. and I love it. I love huge pumpkins. They take up space in your pocket to let you know that they're there. This is a kind of a pretty watch. It says it's got 23 ruby jewels on it. HW Co. Extra Quality. There you go. Specially adjusted. This is a Swiss watch. Some of those words may mean what they mean in the American watch lines of the effort it took to adjust a watch, or maybe not. One of the things that the Swiss did to compete with American watches is they actually copied American watch styles, and those are known as Swiss fakes, and some of the more egregious ones actually have American watchmakers' names on them. Here is another fun Swiss watch. This is a Hebdomus, and I'm probably pronouncing that wrong, but it's one of the first watches that has a visible escapement on it, which you can see prominently displayed in the front of the watch. This watch also has a gigantic spring that takes up the entire back of the watch, and this will run for 8 days, and that's very uncommon. Most watches ran for 24 or 30 hours. And I should have opened this before I started this video so I could show you what that looks like, but basically the whole back of the watch is the spring. Very fun watch. Here we have a Complication Watch. This has got calendar and moon phase. There's a number of those that are very fun. Here we have a little tiny dress watch. And then we have this guy. This is what's called a repeater. What a repeater does is it actually chimes the time. We have this little lever here. I'll wind this up. So it chimed 10 times, indicating 10 o'clock. This is a 15-minute repeater, so we got a ding-dong for the 15, and we got a ding-dong for the half hour. So we know, based on 10 single dings and 2 ding-dongs, that the time is somewhere between 10:30 and 10:45. More expensive watches are called minute repeaters or 5-minute repeaters, and they have more ability to give you an exact time at quite a bit more cost. Unfortunately, those are hard to be able to afford for the average person. This one wasn't too bad because it's sort of a low-grade watch in a gold-filled case rather than a solid gold case. But repeaters are very fun. If you can figure out how to get one for a reasonable price, it's worth your time. We talked about railroad watches briefly back on the American side. There are a few interesting American watches that are non-railroad grade. Railroad watches were very desirable because they were considered high precision, but they're also kind of a pain to use because you have to remove the bezel to set them if they're a lever set watch, which is a requirement of being a railroad watch. Not all Americans are railroad watches. This is a fancy dial American dress watch. This is a hunter case, meaning it's got metal on both sides, and you push the crown to open that. This is also pendant set, so it works like a modern watch. You pull the crown out, and then you can set the time. This guy is a military watch. This is a Hamilton 4992B. And if you notice this, the numbers go to 24 on it, and that's because this is a 24-hour watch. It tells you military time. The other interesting thing about this watch is it has a hacking feature, and that means that if you were going on a mission where timing was critical, your captain says, synchronize your watches. So everybody pulls out their crown like that, and you can see that the second hand stops. And then we wait until the time comes around to where your watch is, and then you punch the crown back in, and the watch resumes so that you can have up to the second timing synchronization between the watches in your group. If you're willing to expand your definition of a watch slightly, you can get into something like this. This is a boxed navigational watch. More expensive versions of these are called chronometers. This is maybe a little bit borderline to call it a chronometer because this is a Hamilton basically 940 pocket watch in a gimbal mount. But these are very cool and were used in naval navigation for varying durations of a trip. This watch is essentially just a pocket watch put in this kind of case. And so this might have been used in a boat that would be offshore for a week and then come back home where extreme accuracy wouldn't be that important. Watches that were used for cross-continental travel would be more sophisticated, and I'll do a video on those at some point too. This was just a quick flyover of some of the things that are out there. I hope to go into more detail in future videos, but for now, I hope this gives you a little taste of what you can find. Thanks for watching.